Hey everyone, what's going on? Sunken Forest here. I'm just here today to talk to you about a little project that I've been working on. The name of it is Elemental, and just to sum it up quickly, it's 4 pieces of audio, each related to one particular element, and it's solely made from field recordings, so there's no synthesis trickery. Well, maybe a little bit, but nothing, no operators, anything like that massive. So I'm just going to play the track for you first, and then I'll go through a little bit about what I've done and maybe talk about some sound design and some arrangement. So have a listen first. So there we go. So that's air. I'll just go through a few of the different elements that I have going on in this track. It's pretty well coordinated in comparison to a lot of other projects, color coding, naming, and whatnot. But it's pretty simple in terms of arrangement. I mean, I've got my bass down the bottom, then I've got my drum tracks, drums in inverted commas. Then I've got some effects, some musical things that I've made, and a lot of different vocal combinations, appropriately named, as you can see, and a few atmospherics, risers, and some background ambience from some recordings of wind that I made. So let's just go through, and I'll solo a bunch of the things, and we'll talk about how I did that. So starting from the top down, this is kind of like the atmospherics bed of air. As I was saying, it's mainly made up of wind recordings, and most of them have been, aggressively high passed, a little bit of compression just to bring up the volume, and one of my favorite plugins, LFO Tool. It's a little easier, or you have more control over, say, creative sidechain effects. So I mean, if we listen to what we have from the wind, so nothing too special. It's mainly just there to act as a sort of bed of sound underneath the rest of the existing audio. So moving on from the wind samples, we have these whooshes and risers, and similar kind of thing. Actually, they're made from sound design pieces that I've done, and I like to separate my sessions somewhat. So I spent a few days just creating sound design pieces, basically by manipulating the recordings that I made with a portable field recorder. So I can show you the original. So the original sounded like this. And it's basically some reversed white noise from the recording, basically. So when you sort of put these things together in a few different layers, and you mess around with the levels of them, transpose fades and whatnot, you kind of get this really nice sort of humanistic feel that's not present in synths such as Massive. So let's just have a listen to this little section here. Something to bear in mind as well is that I actually I spent a bit of time in the studio with a friend of mine named Taras, and we basically spent about 2 hours just recording a bunch of different vocal takes. We're not singers, obviously, by any stretch, but what we did was we made effects from these. So it's things like just going into the microphone and things like that, and then combination of reverbs and delays and whatnot, and you get quite interesting textures from things like that. So that's the whoosh section, should we call it. Then I made a few other things then, and these are mainly from the studio sessions. So big up Taras, you'll be involved heavily in this section. So here's what we've got. I've named them How They Sound, just so I can kind of see clearly where they are on the timeline, really, more than that. And it's things like this. So those kind of things. Most of those were made, by pitching up and down and whatnot. But they're sent quite heavily to reverb units. This one's actually off, but I've used a lot of them with complete dry wet, so it's completely wet basically. There's no dry signal coming through, so it's just really the reverberation tail more than anything else that I'm getting from it. And didn't send this internally in any other way, and they kind of came through like that, and I really like the feel that I got from them. These two were actually, we sent through like a standard sort of note through the headphones in the studio, and we tried our best to stay in key with that, mainly so I could put it in a sampler, and then I could play notes as it were along with it. These two are sort of pitched up and pitched down versions of each other, just sort of going ooh or ah, stuff like that. And I put them in a sampler and just looped sections of them with a forward and back motion, and put a bit of chorus and LFO tool and whatnot. It seems excessive, but it all kind of adds up in small increments. So this is this section. Pretty cool, I thought. And that's kind of it really for the vocal section. Moving on to the effects and the musical side of things, this chord sound design, I'll play it for you first. So the way that was made was by basically putting it through a convolution reverb. So it was just a few different granular stretching exercises that I was playing around with, and I thought I'd try the convolution reverb, but without a standard impulse response. So basically what I did was I put a chord in there, like a musical chord, and it just sort of gave it this choir-esque feel, which is why I sort of call it a chord stab. You get this. Again, pitched down quite heavily. The string, on the other hand, well, it came from the same sound design session, but it just gave it a different character when I pitched it up. You ended up with this. Really cool effect. I'd definitely suggest looking into convolution reverb if you ever get a chance, if you're interested in sound design. So moving on from that, we have the effects section, which is basically these three. I might play them in isolation just so you get an idea of what's going on with each one. So we have this. Again, from the same session as the strings and the chords, but it didn't seem as musical as these two for me. This was more of just a sort of almost like a whoosh kind of riser that I wanted in between hits to fill things out. You know, nothing out of the ordinary really. This gated effects, to demystify this, what I like to do is when I'm doing sound design sessions is I'll set up a channel to record, and I'll play with a bunch of different plugins over the top of it and manually tweak things as I go and record one long audio file. Once I've got, once I feel like I've reached the pinnacle really of what I'm trying to do, I will go back through that audio file and chop up little sections of it. As you can see here, that the file itself is quite long, but there's only a few sort of brief segments used. And you might find that, for an hour-long sound design session, you might get 10 seconds of really worthwhile audio. But for this one, I believe I used FabFilter Timeless. It's a really, really great plugin. A lot of cool modulation effects in there. And yeah, have a listen to this. So the keen listeners amongst you might have noticed that it's very similar to what's going on in the rest of the track. And the reason for that is that sometimes later on in the session I feel like I need something to fill out the gaps that I have. So what I'll do is I'll put an effects unit on the master track and record tweaks that I'm making there. And you end up with all of these different variations, but they all sound cohesive in the context of the track. So that's the gated effect. And next we have the drums, and I think I'll play these all together just so you can get an idea of how they sound. And I mean, this is probably the best section to go from. And I'll admit, this does sound like I've recorded, at least some actual percussive parts, but there's quite a lot of trickery going on in this one. We'll have a look at the kick. So one of my favorite synths is X for Records Serum. If you don't have it, it's not an expensive synth by any stretch, so I'd highly recommend it. And it looks like I've just used the synthesis engine, but what I actually did was I put one of my recordings from the recording session that I had. So I believe for this one it was air again. And what I did was I imported it, normalized it so it was loud enough, and then scanned through until I found something that resembled a sine wave. I'm not going to go too far into how you synthesize a kick drum, but a sine wave is a really good start for that. And what I did was I just used the envelopes to modulate a few different parameters. So, I mean, this one does the level of both of the oscillators. This one, I believe, does the coarse pitch. Okay, so I went slightly different on this. Normally I do the global tuning, but I guess I went coarse pitch on this one. And it's just a real fast pitch drop. And I also put a high pass filter on there. I don't really need anything that low in a kick drum. It'll kind of interfere with any low end business that I put in later. So I like to keep a little bit of space. And I didn't modulate it, I guess. I just put it on there as is and just swept around until I found, a sweet spot. A little bit of processing, to say the least. Distortion, compression, EQ, filter. And I know that some people have an issue, you say you have to put an EQ before a compressor, but really it depends on what you're trying to achieve. There's no right or wrong way to go around it. And the reason I've put the EQ afterwards was because I'm using it more as a shaping tool as opposed to cleaning up the signal so certain frequencies don't affect the compressor. And the filter was just a bandpass, and I actually just didn't modulate it again, but I just swept around until I found somewhere that it sat well. And what you end up with all that is basically this. Sounds like a kick drum. No EQing, but I guess I just left it there just in case. A little bit of overdrive and a limiter just to push the level up. That's actually doubled, but this one is more of a top layer. So it's more of the click sound of a kick drum, the sharp sort of transient sound of it. A lot of these are just from my default audio tracks, so none of these are actually getting used. Get rid of those. And it just adds another layer to it, basically. So next up we have the snares. These snares were actually made from, believe it or not, recordings of wind. So it's just a long recording of some wind through the gum trees near my place of residence, and it's ramped up in volume quite a bit. And I did a similar sort of thing as what I do with kick drums, really, is that I put a real sharp pitch envelope on it. And I actually FM'd it a little bit, but it was more just to get the initial transient. It wasn't to affect all of the sound. I just wanted to get a little sharpness to it. So if we listen to both of them, there's two different versions, and this one is, again, from the sound design sessions, but let's have a listen. So something you might notice from this snare is that it sounds different with every hit. And the reason for it is that I've sent it through the sends in Ableton just to varying degrees, basically. So it's just introducing different harmonics, I guess. If I open my returns track, it's I've just got two returns. One's a reverb and one's a delay. And they just come in at different sort of sections, basically, just to fill out the gaps and to make it seem more interesting. And the other snare is obviously just a little bit of a dry sort of offbeat snare. The next section is the perk delay, so percussion delay. I like to abbreviate things. And it seems like there's a lot going on, but none of this is actually getting used. I guess I just left this one here from a previous sort of mess around section. So this came from the Timeless session that I was talking about, the Fab Filter Timeless, and this is what I had from it. Doesn't sound like much, really, and it's not. It's just a small touch, just something that adds a bit of life to the rhythm of the track. It is heavily EQ'd. The main reason for that, I mean, if I bypass it and you listen to it, it sounds like this. Real muddy, and it could be useful in a breakdown of the track, but I just wanted it to fill out the rest of it. And Ozone to spread it, not in the correct kind of way. I guess this could introduce some phase problems, but it just sounded right, and sometimes you just have to go with your ears, really. So the last part of the track is the bass. And for the bass, I've used Serum again in a similar kind of method as what I did with the kick drum, but I just scanned through until I found more harmonically rich waveform, I guess. Pitched down, and there's two of them, and they're actually detuned from each other, so it's sort of like the old school Reese sound, and that's kind of what I was going for with the whole thing, really. I just wanted a bit of undulating movement amongst the whole thing. And this is the amp envelope, and it just has a fairly sharp attack, but it sort of tails off to -4 decibels with the sustain, so it just kind of eases out of every note, really. And the reason for this LFO was that originally I was modulating a low pass on it, but I decided to leave that and just filter everything that I didn't want in the signal. And yeah, a bit of multi-band compression, because I found that it was really hard to control what was going on with these wavetables that I'd made, and there were a lot of peaks and troughs in the volume, and I also tried to take that into account when I was programming, so some of the velocities are slightly different and whatnot. But I'm actually really pleased with how the bass turned out. I'll play it for you. So it sounds like a bass line to me, but it's actually wind, and it was really fun to try and coax bass out of something that didn't necessarily have it. But that's the whole project, really. Not incredibly complicated, but you put everything together, and all of a sudden you have something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And that's the run through of Air. So I'll be looking at the other 3 pieces after this one, but I hope it's been a bit of an insight into creatively making music out of things that you wouldn't normally find to be musical. Thanks a lot. Bye.